back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again, I always look forward to our conversations, is Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is, I believe, Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at the New School University in New York. And I'm doing all this from memory. So far, so good. Host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV and the author of a number of books, latest of which is The Sickness is the System, about the COVID epidemic. And first of all, Richard Wolff, as always, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Very glad to be here.
One of the things I like to do in our conversations, really for both of us and for the audience, is we are all so absorbed in the day-to-day, and you and I talk about it a lot individually and together, what the Fed is doing wrong, what the government should do differently, how we should react to event X or event Y, and that's important. It's important to navigate the day-to-day crises and issues and help people understand them more deeply. So I'm not disparaging that. But one of the things I really enjoy doing with you is looking at, I think of Teddy Kennedy quoting his brother, the Greek quote, some people look at the world as it is and say why. I look at the world as it could be and say why not. I mean, there's something to that. And so with that in mind, I like to, from time to time, talk about the world as it could be, because I think it's important for us to know that these are realizable visions, not impossible dreams. And between the dream and the reality lies the shadow, said T.S. Eliot. So you have to, to get through the shadow, you start with the dream first. So with that in mind, as a topic for today, I have suggested what globalization would look like if it worked for workers and not for capital. Because we all, and this is my snapshot, simplistic, I know, overly simplistic, but of the world as it works now. You have capital becoming increasingly global and not respecting borders in the same sense. It remains perhaps the last area where the U.S. retains a clear hegemony. The dollar is the anchor currency of the world. The U.S. controls the digital flow of money, as I understand it. Multinational institutions like the IMF are still, and World Bank are still dominated by U.S. influence, as of course is the UN. So, but capital can flow with relative ease from border to border, whereas workers fighting for a more economically just society are divided by nation states. They're divided by geography. They're divided by the laws that can be passed at a state level, which are often inadequate to confront the global powers of capital. So, I've always thought, the slogan, after all, was workers of the world unite, and not just workers of this one sovereign nation unite. And I think more than ever, that kind of thinking makes sense. So with all of that in mind, I propose this topic. So I guess question number one, does my analysis of why, of the global situation resonate at all with you, make any sense to you?
Absolutely, it makes sense to me, and I think the question is very good. I would even go further and commend you. Every worthwhile human thought that I know of carries within it, even if it's only implicit, the question, could it be better? Should it be better? How might it be better? How might we get to where it's better? I mean, in a way, that's been the theme of the human race for as long as we can trace it. That's why we live differently now and think differently and eat differently and dress differently, because people who were doing all those things differently imagined doing it otherwise and struggled to get to that otherwise that they found most attractive. And a short language term for that is called human progress. if we don't make explicit how things could be, if we don't look imaginatively at how things could be, we wouldn't have a clear notion of where we're going and where we'd like to be 5, 10, or 15 years from now. And we'll be there whether we have a good notion of it or not. But the whole idea is we'd be better off thinking about it, comparing different options than we would be if we didn't. It's the same rationale for everything human beings ever think about. And I'm an economist. So, for example, we teach in the American universities overwhelmingly what's called neoclassical economics. It's an economic system in which private actors, individuals, and enterprises meet in an institution called the market to carry out their various functions. And then we tell a story to our students over and over again about how a capitalist system characterized by many buyers and many sellers of everything is an efficient free market capitalist system. That is all utopian. We've never had a free market. That's an illusion. Enthusiasts or ideologues like to have us believe that we've already arrived at this heaven on earth, but sober-minded people know very well that that's never been true and is not true now. At a time when literally every day the United States government is explaining how it's going to subsidize this industry, how it's going to stop that company from doing business over there. I mean, the level of regulation is a joke compared even to what it was 5 or 10 years ago. And it was regulated then too. So yeah, it's a utopian dream woven into the everyday teaching with a very fuzzy border between the utopian imaginary and the actuality that everyone lives in. So why should we on the left be any less welcoming of the kind of question you posed for today? What would a globalization of the working class or of working people look like? What would it mean? How would we get there? What would it require? And all of those kinds of questions. And the first level of answer, assuming that we still have a capitalist system, in other words, we have capital and we have labor, the first thing a globalization of the labor movement would, or of working people in general, would mean would be to pose obstacles to the way capital has for so long played off one group of workers against another. It's a horrible program that capital has imposed on the human race, sequestering this group from that group in order to frustrate the wage aspirations of one group by literally threatening them with shifting employment to the other group, thereby pitting workers against each other, nation against nation, white workers against non-white workers, male workers against female. I mean, it never stops. And capital is always looking to save money on its labor costs. That's the polite way of not facing what you're doing, but you're destroying all the efforts of working people to build equality, democracy, fraternity, all those lovely goals that the capitalists once championed, but are now there. The capital is the biggest obstacle to realizing these sorts of equalities. And so the first thing I would think about would be, what would it mean if a globalization took seriously the concept of equality among working people? It would mean that you do not permit hundreds of millions of people living on less than $2 a day, the official World Bank cutoff line for extreme poverty, while other workers are, earning six-figure salaries all over the place, supervisory workers and so on. You wouldn't do that. And you wouldn't do it not only in the name of the abstract principle of equality, but, for example, you would have much less conflict in the world, if we weren't constantly juxtaposing horrifically poor people against horrifically wealthy people. Well, what are we doing? This kind of inequality, we all know, breeds bitterness, resentment, envy, jealousy, hatred. I could go on with a long biblical list of horrors, but those are horrors that, if not caused by, they are certainly perpetuated and reinforced by the kinds of inequality that capitalism has not only produced, but worsened over most of its history. Inequality is worse today than it was 2, 4, 8, 10 years ago. And when occasionally enthusiasts for bourgeois economics want us to remember that working people are better off today than they were 300 years ago, you know, we live longer, our diets are better, and I don't dispute that for a minute, but I know why our diets are better and our lives last longer. It's because capitalism has been defeated in countless struggles to prevent that. I mean, I'm going to take one example just from right now. The minimum wage in the United States, federal level minimum wage, covers the whole 50 states, is $7.25 an hour. Now, right there is an abomination what that means for anyone who has tried to live on $7.25 per hour before taxes. You know, it's crazy. But now the craziness is compounded with the lesson I would like to draw. The last time the minimum wage was raised by the United States Congress was 2009. Okay, that's now pushing 13, 14 years ago. The inflation, the rising prices that any poor person working for $7.25 had to pay is up between 20 and 30% from 2009. If the prices have all gone up by 20 or 30%, but we have the same minimum wage, which we do, then that minimum wage, in terms of its real value, has been cut by 20 or 30%. What kind of behavior is this? The labor movement in the United States has pushed for a rising minimum wage every one of the last 13 or 14 years. The AFL-CIO, whatever else you may think of it, made its position clear. So have all kinds of liberal people. You know who opposes it, raising it? The Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
The associations of restaurants and retail establishments, you know, the kind of people that pay those lofty salaries and wages. So what we have gained over the last 300 years has come despite capitalism, not before it. And it takes a really courageous mentality on the part of defenders of capitalism who blocked every advance the working class has sought. I don't want to remind folks that it took centuries to get the working day down from 16 and 14 hours a day to 8. And that was opposed at every stage by the capitalists. So what we have is a capitalism that delayed for decades or centuries what they now want us to praise them for having delivered. Where are all the dead and sick people who couldn't get help because they were working 12 hours a day for decades because of capitalism? Those are cleverly not counted. We're told to look at the standard of living now and then give credit to the very agency that blocked it. A brotherhood of working people, a transnational globalization, would never have allowed this and would have had the unity that comes from a globalization to make sure these kinds of behaviors were never visited on any working class, nor would they have allowed one group of workers to be played off again. They would have understood that for what it is, and they would have reacted correspondingly.
You know, I was in Ghana in 2006, I think it was, maybe 2007, and in West Africa. And at that point, people were saying, you're an American, you should really open a call center in Ghana because all the call center jobs in the U.S. had already moved from the U.S., many of them, to India. And, the Indians now, they're asking a little bit too much money. And people speak a lovely English in Ghana, and you could open a call center here and underbid it was a government, this idea. You could underbid the Indians, and because their workers want too much now. So, it's just this global race to the bottom for working people as the wealthy few amass more and more. And it seems to me it's something we should be thinking about. It's one thing, quite rightly, to say that we need a strong labor movement in the U.S. We certainly do. But on the other hand, we also need a strong global labor movement. I know there are some organizations that work at it. I think, is it COSATU or one of those? There are a couple international labor groups. I think I talked to Sharon Burrow, as the director of one. But in general, aside from, I think Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist, has tried to organize something called a Progressive International. I think Jeremy Corbyn is trying to do something. But by and large, these, however good their efforts may be, don't strike me as ground up, roots-based labor organizations. They strike me as organizations of people who are already politically active. I don't know how one would go about doing that, but it seems to me the real challenge is to get working people educated about how their lives globally could be better, what the forces are working against that, and what they can do to construct something better for themselves.
Yeah, I noticed, for example, that the labor movement has always had a segment of itself that understood the following proposition. If you are a labor movement, a labor union, and you are located in a so-called advanced capitalist industrialized economy like the United States, then you face a perpetual danger that capital will escape your success in improving the condition of your members. You fight hard with strikes and other weapons to get a decent job for your people, decent income, decent working conditions. But the irony of capitalism, the horror of it, is that the more successful workers are in squeezing out of capitalists the quality of life they need, they deserve, and they should always have, the more successful workers are, the greater the incentive they give to their own employer to escape the higher wages, to escape the better working conditions by moving to a place where there aren't unions, where there are bribable governments, and so on. In other words, the better off you are here in the United States, the better off the working class was able to get, say, across the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. That produced, the exodus. It produced the decision of capitalists to say, okay, it's too expensive, just like you said about Ghana. It's too expensive here in Cincinnati or in Chicago or in St. Louis or Boston. We're leaving. We're going to the American South as a first step. Then we're going to Mexico and Central America, and eventually China and Brazil and wherever. We're leaving, and that is going to undercut your situation. The last 40 years have done that. That's why we haven't had a real wage increase for the average American for 30 years, after having had it for the previous 100 years. This is a remarkable change, and it's all about capital being able to go. So that the labor movement, left wing, if you like, has always argued that it's in the interest of workers in the United States to work closely with their counterparts in Mexico or Guatemala or China or Brazil to get their wages up, because the more successful they are there, the more secure your better situation is here. If you could really translate that into a solidarity movement, a globalized labor movement, you wouldn't have to wait until the capitalists decide it's more profitable to leave the United States. It took them a century, then they did it, and they did it in such a way that they were making money for the capitalists over there who still could pay very low. All of this is constricted and constrained by capitalism because the capitalists are in control. A unified, organized working class, globalized in that sense, could provide a counterweight, the likes of which we don't know about because we've never seen it, since it has been blocked and thwarted at every turn.
You know, I think about, for example, the rhetorical gambit that corporations and their lobbyists have used from time to time, which, by the way, meets the classic definition of the Yiddish word chutzpah, which is that American workers are selfish if they want to keep jobs from, you know, people in the developing world who would jump at the chance to earn $1.50 a day or whatever, because they want their fat, you know, quote unquote, $16 an hour paychecks with some kind of meager offset to their out-of-pocket healthcare costs and maybe 1 week of vacation for every year they work or whatever. So when in fact, of course, you know, that is some nerve on their part to say that. But I think people, let's say working people in this country, may even understand why it's to their benefit to strengthen labor movements around the world. But there's, other than maybe these, you know, this subset of the union movement you're talking about, there's really no mechanism for people to, let's say in this country, to help that, whether it's by subsidizing or speaking for or lobbying for different kinds of trade rules than we have now. I mean, we could have a country where, you know, we don't allow importation of goods that are made at usurious wages, or, you know, I don't know what the rules would be. That might be one or might not be one, but we could be organizing not just for a labor movement in this country, but for a global labor movement here in the United States. And it seems to me there's no mechanism for doing that.
Yeah, you know, a thought that I got from reading American history of the 19th century. It was already becoming clear in the decades after the Civil War that the United States was on a trajectory of rising wealth that included rising real wages. It was a golden time, if you like, for American capitalism. And there were voices already then who said there is obscene wealth being formed here in the United States. It's not going to the mass of people because while their wages are rising, they live at a relatively low standard of living. So then why are there the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and all of what were once called here in America robber barons in the second half of the 19th century? Here was an idea of radicals in the labor movement. This obscene wealth should be taxed away. And what we should be doing is using the money to overcome the horrific inequalities among working people around the world, because those are mobilized by their respective capitalist governments as rationales for war. In other words, you go to war and you tell your people, we're suffering because of those people over there. We're Germans, go kill British. Or we're French, go fight the Russians, or whatever it is. We allow mass mobilizations of workers killing each other and thinking that in the process they are somehow punishing the cause of their oppression and their suffering. That's not your problem. It's been the age-old effort of radicals to say, your problem is the capitalist system and the capitalists who run it in your country. Don't let them inveigle you into wars with other working people. You know, Eugene Victor Debs went to jail in the United States. Very popular, you know, got 1 million votes running for president from his jail cell here in the United States. But he went to jail because he said the working people of America should not go overseas trying to kill European workers. That's not our problem. Those workers are not what's causing us difficulty here. It's our own capitalist class, just as it is the capitalist class of the British. And that was very bold, but it was very clear, an effort to make a solidarity of workers, if only on the basis, let's not kill each other when these capitalists have their great power confrontations, as in World Wars I and II. And by the way, hint, hint, what was going on in Ukraine is once again a great power struggle between one group of capitalist countries, Europe and Western Europe and the United States, and another group, India, China, Russia. You know, yes, they call themselves socialists, but they have the same employer-employee structure of their enterprises as we do here. And let's remember the 2 world wars of the 20th century were fought by and among capitalist countries, no socialist involved other than the Soviet Union, which was not the major player. It was Germany, Britain, America, all capitalist countries, both times. So the socialist period has been relatively peaceful given the kind of catastrophes that capitalism has been capable of.
You know, and as you were speaking, and of course the role of global workers and their really wars not being in their interests, it's been a theme of a lot of literature, a lot of commentary, a lot of music and film and so on over the years. But it makes me think of that moving episode in the First World War when the two sides, the German and I guess primarily British at that point, on Christmas Eve, the Christmas Eve truce, where the two sides set down their weapons and exchanged, drinks and greetings and sang songs and so on, which the generals on both sides made sure to clamp down on very quickly. Also makes me think of the communications that took place between Karl Marx and Abraham Lincoln, which not too many people know of, but Karl Marx sending Abraham Lincoln a draft speech and a letter of congratulation. And I don't think Lincoln ever gave the speech, but I looked it up while we were talking. Abraham Lincoln, 16th president of the United States, first speech after his inauguration said, and I quote, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could not have existed if labor had not first existed." Forgive me for taking a little time. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. Sounds kind of Marxist to me.
Lincoln is famous for that and for several others. And he was a revolutionary, and Americans don't want to face it. He decided, not alone, of course, but he waged a civil war. And as part of that civil war, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, let's explain very briefly. This was the death sentence to the slave economic system of the southern part of the United States. By that declaration, he deprived white slave owners in the South of one of their most important properties. They had purchased those slaves in many cases. That was their, if you like, capital. That was their wealth. That was what they used to amass more wealth. The government of the North took it away by declaring that the slaves could walk away from the master and be free men and women, and the master couldn't do anything about it. Wow. This is dispropriation without compensation. Those slaves masters that weren't given money, weren't given anything. They were told, you had the property last week, you don't have it this week, you're done. That's as dramatic an ending of another class structure as the revolutionaries in 1917 telling the capitalist industrialists, you know that factory that you had last week, you don't have it this week, you're deprived and you're getting exactly nothing for this. Your system is abolished. That's a very revolutionary act. Lincoln did it. This country has been coping with that, the consequences of that ever since, as all great revolutionaries have long-running consequences, because they're the product of long-running build-ups to the revolutionary moment in any case.
And I would only add, that's a great point, and I would only add to that act of emancipation set forth a principle, which is that a society, through its government, can decide that certain forms of ownership are immoral and must not continue. It is immoral to own another human being. So it doesn't matter how much you paid for the human being. It doesn't matter what is considered the market worth of the human being, what the free market has determined you should pay for it. None of that matters. It's immoral to own a human being. So as of now, human beings, all owned, quote unquote, owned human beings are free, which to me, that same principle could be applied to, it is immoral to own rights to a life-saving medication when people are dying. It is immoral to take a profit from the provision of healthcare when people are dying. It is, we could go on. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the things that are required for those things. It is immoral to withhold those things for the purpose of obtaining personal wealth. That to me seems to me an extension of the revolution that Lincoln began, but I'm curious to know what you think.
I think I would use slightly different language. I would argue that exploitation, in the literal sense that Marx defined it so clearly for us, a situation in which the value of what a human being produces is greater than the value given back to that human being for the expenditure of brain and muscle, labor, in short, that person has expended. I consider that to be immoral. And I noticed that not only did capitalism declare slavery immoral in the way you just summarized, but we've done that even in the history of capitalism. It was once common throughout the entire 19th century, for example, and into the 20th of the United States, just to pick one place, we allowed capitalists to hire children as young as 5 and 6 years of age. American history is full of it. If you study the garment district in New York City, you can still get photographs of masses of children in unspeakable conditions, suffering physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, being paid next to nothing, while the employer explains what a wonderful gift this is he's giving to the poor families, because they'd be even poorer if they couldn't sell a 6-year-old daughter into some factory situation. Well, at a certain point in American history, it was declared immoral. And we don't care what business you're in, or you can't employ a child under 15, 16, whatever the ages were. You can't. The businesses screamed, we will now be unprofitable. You're driving us out of business. Response of the American people, we don't care. You are not going to destroy another generation of children. I'm putting them in those conditions. Therefore, you're going to have to find other ways to make a profitable business. And you know what the irony is? They did. And we don't have child labor the way we once did. We have to be on guard and keep sneaking in. And quite a few companies long ago learned that they can do in Malaysia and Indonesia what they can't do here. But it opens the space for the workers in those countries. And here again, were we to be globalized in a working class, we would have much sooner had the transmission of what it took to end child labor here, being able to do that over there as well.
They also said, you can't get a 14-year-old down a chimney. You have to get a 6-year-old. But, they figured out how to use a pipe thing to, So absolutely. And I guess, people also, they say, well, then you're talking about a Stalinist state deciding all this stuff, which it doesn't have to be. That's one model, but the anarcho-syndicalists in Spain, the unions or affinity groups of workers would negotiate among one another. There's my understanding of it. There are multiple models for doing this, but it's right. But it starts with the basic assumption that extracting more from the population in worth, in economic value, then you give back to them is unjust and gives a rise to injustice. Have I got that right?
Yep. I would let me say one thing in conclusion. The reference to Stalin. Stalin was a dictator, no question. Stalin was horrible as a dictator, no question. We have dictators all over the place, but we clean them up. We give them a different name. And the name we like to give them is CEO. And let me explain. The CEO decides unaccountably. Nobody votes for the CEO among the workers that he supervises. So the CEO can decide to close the factory in Sheboygan, destroying the economic foundation of that community, not just the lives of all the workers without a job, but all the local storekeepers who have no customers anymore, all the rest. We know it across the Rust Belt of this country, which is called that because a lot of CEOs at around the same time made the decision, screw the people here who helped me build this industry, screw the community that subsidized me 12 ways to Sunday. I'm finding greener pastures somewhere else. I'm out of here, and I can do it, and all I need to do is please a few major shareholders, and we're out of here. That is dictatorial, or if you like, that is Stalinism. And it isn't any better because it's done by a person whose name isn't Stalin. Lots of people die when that happens. Lots of people get physically and mentally sick when that happens. A lot of societies turn to fascism when this kind of thing happens. Look for scapegoats, behave horribly to those scapegoats. This is awful stuff, and calling it Stalin means you don't want to see it much closer to home, even though it's all around you.
Well said, to which I'll only add, as I often say, bosses aren't job creators, workers are boss creators. But that said, Richard Wolff, as always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for coming on the program.
And my thanks to you for having this program and keeping it going. It's a good public service in the best sense of the term.
Thank you so much. And we'll be right back after this. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.